October 15, 1943. 1,347 hours. 28,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. Oberst Friedrich Vogel, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 11, received a radio transmission that would haunt the Luftwaffe for the rest of the war. His radar operators reported a new type of American fighter, sleek, silver, and accompanying the bomber formations deeper into the Reich than any escort had ever reached. Vogel laughed into his radio mask. "Let them come," he said. "Their fuel tanks will run dry before their courage does." 15 minutes later, Vogel was dead. His Focke-Wulf 190, one of the most feared fighters in the European theater, had been shredded by 6.50 caliber machine guns from an aircraft the Germans had dismissed as nothing more than a reconnaissance plane with delusions of grandeur. The Americans called it the Mustang. The Germans would soon call it Der Wurzangel, the Angel of Death. What followed wasn't just a shift in air superiority. It was the systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe's veteran pilot corps and the complete collapse of Germany's defensive air strategy. The German High Command's intelligence assessment of the North American P-51 Mustang, dated March 1943 and recovered from Luftwaffe archives after the war, reads like a masterclass in catastrophic underestimation. The American P-51 aircraft, the report stated, represents no significant threat to Reich air defenses. Limited range, inadequate high-altitude performance, and inferior armament make this aircraft suitable only for ground attack and reconnaissance roles. Our FW-190 and Bf-109 fighters maintain absolute superiority at all combat altitudes. This assessment came from General Major Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most experienced fighter commanders and a veteran of over 700 combat missions. Galland had built his reputation on accurate tactical analysis. His assessment of the early Allison-engined P-51s had been correct. They were indeed mediocre performers at high altitude, but Galland's intelligence officers had made a fatal assumption that American aircraft development had reached its limit. They had no idea that across the Atlantic, a revolution in fighter design was already complete. The German defensive doctrine in late 1943 was built on mathematical certainty. American B-17 and B-24 bombers, flying from bases in England, could reach targets deep in Germany. But their fighter escorts, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, could only accompany them to the German border before fuel limitations forced them to turn back. This created what Luftwaffe planners called the Tod Zone, the Death Zone, a 200-mile corridor of German airspace where American bombers flew without fighter protection. Here, German fighters could attack with impunity, using tactics refined over 4 years of air combat. The statistics supported German confidence. Between August and October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 214 bombers over Germany, with crew casualties exceeding 2,100 men. The October 14th raid on Schweinfurt, later called Black Thursday, saw 60 bombers shot down out of 291 dispatched, a 20% loss rate that was mathematically unsustainable. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, told his staff in November 1943, "The Americans are bleeding themselves white. They send their bombers deeper each week, and each week we slaughter them when their fighters turn back. They cannot sustain these losses. They will be forced to abandon daylight bombing or accept complete defeat." German fighter pilots shared this confidence. Hauptmann Werner Hoffmann, commanding 2 Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 1, wrote in his diary on November 3, 1943, "Encountered American fighters today near the Dutch border. P-47s as usual, fat and cumbersome. They turned back at the border as always, and we pursued the bombers to Brunswick. Shot down 2 B-17s without difficulty. The Americans seem incapable of producing a fighter with both range and performance. Their technology lags behind ours by at least 2 years. The Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine exploited this American weakness with brutal efficiency. German fighters would shadow the bomber formations, staying just outside range of the escorts. The moment the P-47s and P-38s turned back, visible by their distinctive banking turns and descent, the German fighters would attack. They developed the Sturmgruppe tactic. Heavily armored FW-190s would attack bombers head-on. their cannons firing from close range where bomber defensive fire was least effective. Meanwhile, Bf-109s provided top cover against any American fighters that might somehow extend their range. Oberst Hans Trubenbach, operations officer for Luftwaffe, documented the defensive strategy in his October 1943 operational order. Enemy penetration beyond 250 kilometers from English coast presents ideal engagement opportunity. Fighter forces will maintain readiness at forward airfields. Attack will commence only after enemy escort fighters have withdrawn. Under no circumstances will German fighters waste fuel and ammunition on escort fighters when bomber formations represent primary targets. This doctrine had proven devastatingly effective. Luftwaffe fighter wings stationed across Germany could predict with reasonable accuracy when and where American bombers would become vulnerable. The mathematics of fuel consumption, bomber formation speeds, and German fighter response times had been calculated down to the minute. Intelligence reports from German radio intercept units provided additional confidence. They had cracked American radio codes and could monitor the calls from escort fighters. Bingo fuel. Returning to base. These messages, heard repeatedly on every deep penetration rate, confirmed what German planners believed to be an immutable physical limitation. The Luftwaffe had also studied captured American aircraft extensively. At the Reckland test facility, German pilots had flown captured P-47s and P-38s. Their reports emphasized the same limitations: excellent aircraft within their range. But that range ended at the German border. General Lieutenant Joseph Schmid, commanding Jagdkorps I, synthesized all intelligence in his November 1943 strategic assessment. American fighter development has reached a technological ceiling. The laws of physics dictate that no single-engine fighter can carry sufficient fuel for deep penetration missions while maintaining combat performance. The enemy must choose between range and capability. They cannot have both. What German intelligence had failed to detect was a modification so simple, yet so revolutionary, that it would invalidate every calculation in their defensive doctrine. In a wind tunnel at Wright Field, Ohio, American engineers had discovered that by replacing the P-51's Allison engine with a Rolls-Royce Merlin and adding external drop tanks to supplement internal fuel, they could create a fighter that could reach Berlin and back with fuel to spare for combat. The first Merlin engine P-51BS began arriving in England in November 1943. German intelligence, focused on counting bombers and tracking known fighter types, barely noticed. After all, they had already assessed the P-51 as a ground attack aircraft. That a few more had arrived seemed inconsequential. The Luftwaffe's defensive preparations continued based on proven assumptions. Fighter wings maintained their positions. Pilots refined their attack patterns. Ground crews maximized sortie rates for the critical moment when American bombers entered the death zone unescorted. They prepared for everything except the impossible. An American fighter that could escort bombers to any target in Germany, fight on equal or superior terms with German fighters, and still return to England with fuel to spare.
The aircraft that would destroy the Luftwaffe began not as a fighter, but as a desperate attempt to save a failing company. In 1940, North American aviation had never built a fighter aircraft. When the British Purchasing Commission approached them to build P-40s under license, company president James Kindleberger made an audacious counterproposal. "Give us 120 days and we'll design something better." The British, skeptical but desperate for aircraft, agreed. Edgar Schmood, North American's chief designer, led a team that worked around the clock. They studied every fighter design available, learning from British and German innovations. The result was the NA-73X, which would become the P-51 Mustang. The original design was revolutionary in its simplicity. Schmood utilized laminar flow wings, a new aerodynamic concept that reduced drag significantly. The radiator scoop beneath the fuselage was positioned to create thrust rather than drag, a counterintuitive innovation that added speed. Every surface was refined for minimum drag and maximum efficiency. But the aircraft had a critical flaw. Its Allison V1710 engine provided excellent low-altitude performance, but suffered above 15,000 feet, exactly where bomber escort missions were fought. The British RAF used early Mustangs for low-level reconnaissance and ground attack, where they excelled. As fighters, they were mediocre. The transformation came through an insight by Ronald Harker, a Rolls-Royce test pilot. In April 1942, after flying a Mustang at the RAF's test facility in Boscombe Down, Harker immediately called his superiors. "If you put a Merlin engine in this airframe, you'll have the best fighter in the world." The Merlin engine, already powering Spitfires and Hurricanes, was Britain's most advanced aircraft engine. It featured a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that maintained power at high altitudes. When combined with the Mustang's low-drag airframe, the results exceeded every prediction. Packard Motor Company in Detroit began producing Merlin engines under license in August 1942. The first P-51B with a Packard Merlin flew on November 30, 1942. Test pilots reported performance that seemed impossible: 440 miles an hour at 30,000 feet, superior to any German fighter. But speed alone wouldn't solve the escort problem. The breakthrough came from Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hitchcock, a former World War I ace serving as assistant air attaché in London. Hitchcock recognized that the Mustang's efficiency meant it could carry external fuel tanks and still outperform German fighters. His memo to General Karl Spaatz, dated March 1943, proved prophetic. With drop tanks, a P-51B can escort bombers to any target in Germany. This aircraft will change the air war. The engineering challenge was significant. External fuel tanks added drag and weight, but the Mustang's aerodynamic efficiency compensated. With two 75-gallon drop tanks plus internal fuel, a P-51B could fly 850 miles, fight for 30 minutes, and return to base, a combat radius of over 600 miles. By comparison, the P-47 Thunderbolt had a combat radius of 230 miles. The P-38 Lightning could reach 350 miles. The Mustang could fly twice as far as existing escorts, and it could fight better when it got there. Production began at North American's Inglewood, California facility in May 1943. The first P-51Bs reached England in October 1943, equipping the 354th Fighter Group at Boxted Airfield. The 354th, designated a Pioneer Mustang Group, would prove the aircraft's capabilities in combat. German intelligence completely missed the significance. Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographs showed new silver aircraft at British airfields, but they were catalogued as additional P-51 reconnaissance variants. The intelligence summary from Luftwaffe 3, dated November 1, 1943, mentioned them briefly. Increased numbers of P-51 aircraft observed at Eastern England airfields. No change in threat assessment. These aircraft remain suited only for tactical reconnaissance and ground attack missions. This failure of intelligence stemmed from fundamental assumptions. German analysts knew the early P-51A's limitations. They assumed American engineering couldn't overcome them. They never imagined that by changing engines and adding drop tanks, the Americans had created a new class of fighter. Major General William Kepner, commanding 8th Fighter Command, recognized the strategic opportunity. His operational order for December 1943 was revolutionary. Destroy the enemy air force wherever you find it, in the air and on the ground. Previous doctrine had tied fighters closely to bomber formations. Kepner freed them to hunt. The tactical implications were enormous. Mustangs could escort bombers to the target, engage German fighters aggressively, and still have fuel to strafe airfields on the return flight. Every mission could strike the Luftwaffe multiple times. Colonel Donald Blakesley, commanding the 4th Fighter Group, understood immediately. His group transitioned from P-47s to P-51s in February 1944. Blakesley told his pilots, "We're not escort anymore. We're hunters. The Jerrys think they're safe past the German border. We're going to teach them different." The 354th Fighter Group began combat operations with P-51Bs on December 1, 1943. Their orders were to experiment with long-range escort tactics. German reaction was predictable. They ignored the new fighters, focusing on their standard tactics against bombers. Flight Officer Howard Goodner, flying his first P-51 combat mission on December 5th, recalled, "We crossed into Germany, and the German fighters just sat there at altitude watching us. They were waiting for us to turn back like P-47s always did. We didn't turn back. When we kept coming, you could see them scatter. They weren't ready for us to be there." Technical reports from the 354th Fighter Group in December 1943 revealed how completely the Mustang exceeded requirements. Pilots reported fuel remaining after missions deep into Germany, unheard of for previous escorts. The aircraft could outturn FW-190s and outclimb BF-110s. It could fight at any altitude and still cruise home economically. But the true revolution wasn't just technical. It was psychological. For 2 years, German pilots had fought with one certainty: American escorts would leave. They had built their tactics, their doctrine, their entire defensive strategy on that single fact. The P-51 Mustang didn't just extend escort range. It shattered the fundamental assumption underlying German air defense. Every calculation, every tactical plan, every operational order was suddenly obsolete. And the Luftwaffe wouldn't realize it until far too late.
December 13th, 1943, 12:15 hours. 27,000 feet above Bremen, Germany. Hauptmann Klaus Mitusch, leading 3rd Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 26, positioned his formation of Focke-Wulf 190s for what should have been a routine interception. His radar controller had confirmed the American bomber stream, B-17s heading toward Bremen's U-boat yards. The P-47 escorts had turned back at the Dutch border exactly on schedule, their fuel gauges dictating the inevitable withdrawal. Mitusch's radio crackled, "Achtung, unknown fighters at 3 o'clock high." He turned to look and froze. Silver fighters, sleek, unfamiliar, were diving toward his formation from 30,000 feet. They should not be here. No American fighter had ever penetrated this deep into Germany. At 12:17 hours, Captain Glenn Aggleston of the 354th Fighter Group opened fire. His 6.50 caliber machine guns converged on Mitusch's wingman's FW-190. The German fighter disintegrated in a shower of aluminum and fire. Mitusch broke hard left, his tactical training taking over, even as his mind struggled to process what was happening. The dogfight that followed lasted 8 minutes. When it ended, 3rd Jagdgeschwader 26 had lost 5 aircraft. The American Mustangs, for that's what Mitusch now understood them to be, had lost none. More critically, they didn't leave. They escorted the bombers all the way to Bremen, fought off subsequent interception attempts, and then flew home to England. Mitusch survived. His combat report, filed at 14:30 hours and recovered from Luftwaffe archives, reads with barely controlled shock. Enemy deployed new fighter variant deep over Reich territory. Aircraft identified as P-51 type, previously assessed as reconnaissance only. Performance characteristics. Speed equals or exceeds FW-190A8 at all altitudes. Rate of climb superior to our aircraft. Turning radius competitive. Armament devastating. 6 heavy machine guns. Most critically, aircraft showed no indication of fuel shortage. They remained in combat area for duration of bomber mission. Previous intelligence assessments are completely invalid. Request immediate tactical revision. The German High Command's response was immediate denial. General Major Galland's headquarters issued a directive the same evening. Reports of extended-range American fighters are likely misidentifications. P-47 aircraft may have been fitted with additional fuel tanks. No single-engine fighter can maintain combat performance while carrying fuel for deep penetration missions. All units maintain standard defensive procedures. But the pilots who had faced the Mustangs knew different. Oberleutnant Kranz Knock, an experienced pilot with 19 confirmed kills, encountered P-51s near Osnabrück on December 20th. His diary entry captures the dawning horror. They came from nowhere. Silver devils at impossible altitude. I dived away at full throttle. My Bf-109 normally leaves anything behind in a dive. These Mustangs stayed with me effortlessly. I only escaped by diving through cloud cover and hedge-hopping home. Fuel consumption forced them to break off, but only after pursuing me for 50 kilometers. What kind of aircraft can chase us over Germany and still return to England? The Christmas Eve raid on Ludwigshafen proved the point beyond doubt. Lieutenant Colonel James Howard, flying a P-51B from the 354th Fighter Group, single-handedly defended a bomber formation for over 30 minutes against repeated German attacks. Howard's aircraft was hit multiple times, but he shot down at least 4 German fighters, some witnesses claimed 6, before his ammunition ran out. Howard's fuel gauge on landing at Boxted, 40 gallons remaining. He had flown to Ludwigshafen, fought for half an hour, and still had fuel for another hour of flight. The mathematics that had governed German defensive planning had just been rewritten. Luftwaffe intelligence frantically attempted damage control. A technical assessment dated December 28, 1943, tried to rationalize the impossible. Analysis of P-51 variant suggests Americans have sacrificed armor protection and armament for additional fuel capacity. Aircraft likely vulnerable to aggressive attack. Recommend offensive tactics against this type. This assessment was catastrophically wrong. The P-51B carried the same armor as other American fighters and mounted heavier armament than the Bf-109. What German analysts couldn't accept was that American engineering had simply built a better aircraft. By January 1, 1944, the evidence was overwhelming. Every deep penetration mission featured Mustang escorts. German fighters that had operated with impunity in the death zone now found themselves hunted throughout their own airspace. Major Gunther Rahl, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces with over 200 victories, encountered P-51s on January 11, 1944, near Frankfurt. His assessment, provided in post-war interviews, was brutally honest. The first time I saw Mustangs over Germany, I knew we had lost the air war. Not that day, not that week, but inevitably. They could go anywhere, fight anyone, and return home. We couldn't hide. We couldn't run. Every mission became a fight for survival. The tactical implications cascaded through the Luftwaffe command structure. The Sturmgruppe tactics, heavy fighters making close-range attacks on bombers, became suicide missions when Mustangs were present. The heavily armored FW-190s, optimized for bomber interception, were easy prey for the nimble P-51s. Oberst Johannes Steenhoff, commanding Jagdgeschwader 77, summarized the new reality in his January operations order. Enemy P-51 aircraft have eliminated our tactical advantages. We can no longer predict safe engagement zones. We can no longer rely on escort fuel limitations. Every interception must now assume enemy fighter presence at any location, at any altitude, for indefinite duration. Fighter wings will increase formation sizes and maintain top cover at all times. But increasing formation sizes meant burning more fuel, which limited patrol time. Maintaining constant top cover meant fewer fighters available for bomber attacks. Every countermeasure created new problems. Radio intercepts by Allied intelligence captured the growing desperation. On January 24, 1944, a Luftwaffe controller was heard broadcasting, "All units, break off attack, Mustangs approaching from high altitude." The bombers continued unmolested to their target. Flight Officer Robert Johnson of the 357th Fighter Group, newly arrived with P-51s, described the German reaction on their first mission. "We crossed the border at 28,000 feet. German fighters were below us, setting up on the bombers. When they saw us, they scattered, just broke formation and ran. 3 months earlier, they would have pressed the attack. Now they knew what Mustangs could do." The psychological collapse had begun even before the physical destruction became overwhelming. German pilots, many of them combat veterans with dozens of kills, now hesitated when silver fighters appeared. That hesitation proved fatal. Reich Marshal Göring, confronted with mounting evidence, reportedly told his staff in late January, "If American fighters can escort their bombers to Berlin and back, then the war is lost." His intelligence officers had spent months denying this possibility, but now it was operational reality.
The transformation was complete by June 1944. On D-Day, June 6th, Allied air forces flew 14,674 sorties over Normandy. The Luftwaffe managed fewer than 100. Of those, nearly none reached the beaches. P-51 Mustangs and other Allied fighters had established such complete air superiority that German pilots called the invasion coast Jabo-free Jaeger, the fighter-free zone where only Allied aircraft operated. General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in France, reported to Hitler on June 10th. "The enemy has complete air supremacy. Our troops cannot move in daylight. Supply columns are destroyed before reaching the front. I have not seen a German aircraft in 4 days. Without air support, we cannot hold Normandy." The P-51's strategic impact extended far beyond combat victories. It enabled the precision bombing campaign that destroyed German war production. It made daylight strategic bombing feasible when previous losses had been prohibitive. It allowed the 8th Air Force to attack targets that had been invulnerable. The numbers tell the story. From January through May 1944, American forces flew 61,508 bomber sorties against German targets. The loss rate, 3.8%. Before the Mustang, loss rates of 10 to 15% had forced suspension of deep penetration rates. The difference between 15% and 4% losses was the difference between defeat and victory in the strategic air campaign. German war production collapsed under the sustained assault. Oil production fell 90% by September 1944. Aircraft production, despite massive decentralization efforts, dropped 75% by war's end. Ball bearing production never recovered from the Schweinfurt raids. The Mustang had made all of this possible. Oberst Hajo Hermann, who commanded the Wild Sow night fighter units, later testified, "The P-51 Mustang was the weapon that defeated Germany in the air. Not the bombers themselves, but the fighter that allowed the bombers to reach any target and return safely." Once Mustangs appeared in numbers over Germany, our situation was hopeless. The human cost was staggering. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 13,000 fighter pilots killed between January 1944 and May 1945. Allied air forces lost roughly 18,000 aircrew during the same period, but the Allies could replace them. Germany could not. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, removed from command in January 1945 after repeated clashes with Göring, formed JV-44, an elite unit flying the Me-262 jet fighter. Even this technological marvel couldn't overcome the Mustang's advantages. The P-51 pilots learned to patrol Me-262 bases and attack the jets during takeoff and landing when they were vulnerable. Galland's post-war assessment was unequivocal. Between the spring of 1944 and the end of the war, the P-51 Mustang destroyed the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force. The aircraft itself was excellent, but more importantly, it appeared at the critical moment when we could not counter it. Our pilots' morale collapsed. Our defensive strategy became obsolete. Our training program couldn't produce pilots fast enough. The Mustang made defeat inevitable. The technical legacy influenced aviation development for decades. The Mustang's combination of range, performance, and reliability became the template for post-war fighters. The F-86 Sabre, which dominated Korean War skies, drew directly from P-51 design principles. Modern fighter doctrine, emphasizing range, versatility, and air superiority, traces lineage to the Mustang's revolutionary approach. The strategic lessons resonated through military planning. The Mustang demonstrated that technological superiority could overcome numerical advantages and positional defenses. It proved that industrial capacity combined with engineering innovation could fundamentally alter warfare's calculus. Air Force General Curtis LeMay, who commanded bomber operations in Europe, stated in his memoirs, "The P-51 Mustang was the most important aircraft of World War II. Without it, we could not have executed the strategic bombing campaign. Without strategic bombing, the war in Europe would have lasted years longer with exponentially higher casualties. One aircraft changed the entire trajectory of the war. The psychological dimension proved equally significant. The Mustang destroyed German pilots' will to fight by making survival impossible. This psychological defeat preceded and enabled physical defeat. When experienced pilots began avoiding combat and new pilots refused missions, the Luftwaffe ceased functioning as an organized force. The final accounting is sobering. P-51 Mustangs destroyed approximately 4,950 German aircraft in air combat and another 4,131 on the ground, nearly half of all Luftwaffe losses in Western Europe. The 8th Air Force's fighter groups, predominantly P-51 equipped by 1944, claimed the vast majority of these victories. American production delivered 15,586 P-51s during the war. German factories produced roughly 40,000 fighters during the same period. But production numbers became irrelevant when trained pilots couldn't survive combat against technologically superior opponents. The historical judgment is clear. The P-51 Mustang represents one of warfare's decisive weapons, an innovation so superior it rendered existing strategies obsolete and made enemy resistance futile. It demonstrated that in industrial warfare, technical excellence multiplied by production capacity equals inevitable victory. The Luftwaffe pilots who dismissed the P-51 as a reconnaissance aircraft in 1943 learned a brutal lesson by 1944. Underestimating American engineering and industrial capacity was fatal. Their confidence, built on years of aerial superiority, shattered against an aircraft that could outfly, outfight, and outlast everything they possessed. Today, restored P-51 Mustangs still fly at air shows worldwide. Their distinctive Merlin engines sound evoking both admiration and memory. For aviation enthusiasts, they represent engineering excellence. For historians, they symbolize the moment when technological innovation fundamentally altered warfare. For German pilots who survived, they remain Der Wurgengel, the angel of death that ended the Luftwaffe's reign over European skies. The silver fighters that German intelligence dismissed in 1943 became the instruments of the Luftwaffe's destruction in 1944. They proved a fundamental truth of modern warfare. Victory belongs not to those who fight hardest, but to those who fight with superior tools backed by superior industrial capacity. The P-51 Mustang embodied that truth, and in doing so, changed the course of history.